Uh, First point is how important is the dairy industry to the economy of Utah? This is from USDA Ag Statistics Service data. It's compiled by the Utah Department of Ag and Food on a yearly basis. The most recent that I could find was for 2019. And if you look at this first column, this is cash receipts. The actual number is on the right, and then the percent of the total is on the left, and this is in thousands. So this would be $492 million. And the total for all of ag in the state of Utah is $1.3 billion. So it sounds like a lot, but compared to other states, it's kind of down in the middle. If you look at beef versus dairy products, and I want to make a point of this is dairy products, it does not include the sale of cull cows, calves, or dairy beef. My guess is that they're counted up here with the beef, but it probably isn't going to change the rankings here other than just bring these numbers closer together. You can see that the top two commodities in the state of Utah are beef and dairy products, making up about 70% of the total. The next highest on the list, and this is for 2019, was hay at 21%. If you look at ag exports, the most recent number I have is 2018. You can see that it's flip-flopped a little bit. Again, it's fairly close, and these two make up the majority of them. So in terms of importance to the industry or the state economy, these two aspects make up the bulk of the ag income for the state. As a sideline, Utah began tracking the number of milk cows through the same USDA system in 1867. That's 20 years after the pioneers first came to this valley. So they've been tracking it for a long time, and the number that was recorded was 14. I can't help but think that there was more than 14 milk cows in the state of Utah at that time, but that's what they reported. And the record high was in 1945 at the end of World War II at 126,000. I want you to remember this number because as we go through here, the current and the historical numbers for the state of Utah are slightly less than this, but haven't changed a whole lot over time. This is a compilation of a lot of different values from the National Ag Statistics Service, looking at 1997 when I first started at Utah State versus 2020, which was the last reporting year. If there's a take-home message for this whole thing, this is the take-home message, and I'll re-emphasize it 2 or 3 different ways as we go along. Number of milk cows in the state, 92 versus 97,000. Basically, it hasn't changed over time. If you look at the last 5 years and probably the last 20 years, 95,000 plus or minus a couple of thousand cows is about where we're at. If you remember, the peak was 126,000. We're not that far off of that. So number of cows, the same. Number of dairies has gone down by about 80%. I hope that's not because of me, but you never can tell. The first number is the number of what I would call active commercial dairies. The second number is a USDA counting system where at the 1997, basically anybody with 1 dairy cow was counted as a dairy. After this, they changed the reporting system to anybody with 5 cows and above was considered to be a dairy. So there's a big discrepancy between these two numbers based on who had a cow versus who was making a living out of it. In 2020, the numbers were coming closer together, and currently I talked to somebody from Utah Utah Dairymen's Association last week, and between the two of us, we think that this number is actually closer to 100 dairies. But the last year, there's been so many go out of business and the reporting system's off, so it's hard to tell, but somewhere between 100 and 110 dairies is probably accurate for right now. Price of milk has gone up. This 12.30 is kind of what the industry average was for years and years and years. But then we started getting into price volatility. And so it just so happens that in 2020, the price was up. But then before that, it went down to $13 or $14 and then back up again and down. So it's gone up and down, and that's created some havoc in the system. Total pounds of milk in the system is not quite doubled. And keep in mind, number of cows hasn't changed that much. It hasn't changed enough to account for this total amount. And the reason why there's more milk in the system is because the milk per cow has gone up by about 3,000 or 4,000 pounds of milk per cow. So same number of cows, much fewer dairies, more milk in the system because of more milk per cow, and the value of that product is almost doubled in the 24 years since I started here. I'm going to start showing you some pictures or some figures from DHIA, but I wanted to give you a quick 1-minute primer on DHIA. It's called Dairy Herd Improvement Association. It's a cooperative that has 3 parts, where there's somebody that comes to your dairy and collects milk weights from individual cows. They collect information from births, from inseminations, from deaths, sold, things like that. Then those milk samples go to a lab that analyzes them for fat and protein. The combination of the information from these 2 systems then goes to a computing service that compiles all of the data, analyzes it, and then sends it back to the farmer, genetics groups, and extension as needed. And I want to point out extension is a big part of this, because the original DHIA was established to be managed and run through extension, and that's changed over the years, but this was an extension run thing for years and years. Not all of the dairies in the state participate in it. Utah's probably a little higher than normal, so probably 50 to 60% of the dairies will participate in this. The rest don't. And I've already said it is managed by extension. Again, as a little bit of a historical background, the first testing, so it would be primarily the technician and the lab part, was done about 1911 or 1912 in Richmond, and the Richmond Association included Lewiston, so Lewiston and Richmond together started at this time. And one thing that you may not realize is it's heavily computerized right now, but that computerization of the records from hand entered and computed to computer generated averages and compilations was first developed here at Utah State back in the late 1940s. Bliss Crandall was on faculty here, and he started collecting punch cards from data collected at the farm and running them through a computer in the basement of Old Main. He then spun the company off from the university, and that company is still here in Utah and is still in business. Okay, so the next few slides are going to be data compiled from annual DHIA summaries. And when I started is right here where the arrow is. That's also the same time that Utah DHIA became Rocky Mountain DHIA. So from here back, It started in 1935. From there back was all Utah. From here over was Utah, Southeast Idaho, and Montana. So a little bit different twist on that. So milk per cow, you can see, has gone up. And it kind of took a nosedive right here and is slowly starting to climb back up again. So milk per cow has gone up. So there's probably 83, 84 years worth of data here. Fat percent started off high, hit a low in the beginning of the late 60s, early 70s. And then about the time I started, it really started taking off again. I don't know if I want to take credit for that, but it's interesting that the timing hit about the same. I was on a webinar yesterday with Hordes Dairyman, and they made the comment that milk fat or butter fat percent in the United States was a flat line until about 2010, and then it started to climb. So in this case, we started climbing earlier than 2010, but in the US, it started climbing then. And it's only 2 or 3 hundredths of a percent less than the all-time record for butterfat, which was made in 1945. So Utah is showing the same trend as the US, and they feel like in the next few months, the average butterfat in the US will hit an all-time high. This is pounds of fat in the blue line, pounds of protein in the lower line. Again, the pounds go up. I show this because dairy farmers get paid on pounds of fat and pounds of protein. So as this line goes up, then that means that they should be getting higher amount, depending on what the value of a pound of fat and pound of protein is. But again, protein fairly level across time since I started here. Fat has continued to go up. This starts at 1978 because prior to that time, protein was not reported by the DHI system, at least in our system. We did, but it was collected, but it wasn't reported before then. And then finally, this is Utah DHIA average cows per herd. And again, this is where I started. You can see that the trend for since the 1950s has been more cows per herd, and here in the about 2006 or so, there was a sharp increase, and then it's kind of leveled off at about 350 cows. And this is interesting to me that DHIA is leveling off, but if you look at the number of cows per dairy across the US and also in Utah, that number is still going up. And if you consider that there were 100 dairies in the state in 2021 and 95,000 cows, that'd be 950 cows per dairy. So quite honestly, I didn't expect to see us get to this 1,000 cow per dairy average as quickly as we have, but we're there, or we're knocking on the door, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. In 2017, as part of their ag census, USDA collected extra information that wasn't normally collected. So across the x-axis is herd size, so 1 to 9 cows per herd, 50 to 99 cows per herd, so across the way. The blue bar is number of herds, and then the orange bar is the percent of cows. And to get to percent of cows, I just took the median average number in each one of these groupings and multiplied it out. As you can see, there was a lot of dairies in this 50 to 500 cow range, or 50 to 1,000 cow range, most of them being here. The part I want you to notice is that in the 1,000 cow and larger grouping, there's about 20 herds, but those 20 herds have 60 to 65% of the cows and probably at least 65% of the total milk in the state. So let me say that again, 20% of the herds in the state, or 20 of these herds, have almost 2/3 of all of the cows and the milk in the state. This is in comparison to when I started. There's only 7 herds that were over 1,000 cows at that time. And if you dig even deeper, there's 10 herds in the state that have 50% of the cows. Talk about consolidation and getting big. This, in a nutshell, is kind of where things are going. You have fewer dairies where all of the cows are. And this brings up some interesting problems, I think, that I'll talk about later. So where in the state are the cows? Cache, Utah, Millard, and Box Elder historically have always had some of the highest inventories of dairy cows in the state. I looked at January 2020, which is the most recent numbers I could find. Cache had 18,000, and it also has the most dairies in the state right now. Then Utah, Millard, down to Box Elder. You can read those numbers. The column to the right was a reminder to me that these numbers are misleading in a way, because when you see those numbers, you think, oh, there's a lot of dairies there. Utah County, probably 13 to 14,000 of those 15,000 are on 2 dairies. Millard County, probably about 11,000 or 12,000 of those are on 3 or 4 dairies, maybe 3 owners maximum. Iron County, almost all of those 11,000 are on 2 dairies. And then Box Elder is kind of like Cache. There's still 10, 15 dairies or more. So even though these look like pretty good numbers, when you get right down to it, there's not that many dairies involved with it. It's pretty limited number of dairies. Okay, back to the DHIA data. These are items that aren't part of the story I wanted to tell, but maybe they're of interest. The blue line is age at first calving. So this is when they would come into the herd for the first time. We recommend 23 or 24 months. I cannot, for the life of me, move them off to 26. I've tried and I can't do it. It's one of my failures that bothers me the most, is I can't move this number down where it ought to be. The upper number is number of milk, or the average age of all of the milk cows. And this is in months of age. So this would be somewhere just a little above 42 months, about 45 months. So 42 to 45 months of age is the average. So the different, as these two numbers get together, it means that the cows are getting younger. So as this comes down, the cows in the herds are younger, which also means fewer lactations for those animals over time. Economically, I think it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I think it's also because we've done such a good job of raising heifers. This is days in milk, which is an indirect measure of how good the reproduction is on the dairy. You can see that during this time period right here, reproduction really took a nosedive in Utah. And it's not just Utah, it's across the whole industry in the United States. But since then, we've made a concerted effort to bring it back in line through synchronization programs and a few other things. So it's back almost to normal, but if you remember, our milk production is still going up, even though we're getting back here. So this is one of the successes in industry, I think. And then looking at the mastitis and udder health, this is percent low somatic cell, and the way you interpret this is This is the percent of cows in a herd on average that have a low somatic cell. So the higher the number, the more cows in the dairy have a low somatic cell. And for years and years and years, we were around this 80%, and it never varied hardly at all, more than 1 or 2%. But then in the about 2005, 2006, it started going up, and you can see now we're 89% or so, pushing 90%. So this is another good success story for the industry. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but in thinking about changes in the industry, looking at changes in milking and parlor systems is also another way of gauging how the industry has changed over time. Not hardly any flat barns here in Utah. I think I've only seen one since I've been here, maybe two. Upper Midwest, Northeast, you'll see a lot of these. So when I first started here, herringbone parlors were the norm. Then over time, they started to get retrofitted, or new builds were for parlors, parallels, sorry. The only difference between these two is the orientation of the cow in relationship to the milker, that you can fit more cows into the same space as you could here. So it went from here to here, and then some dairies continue with this, but I've seen a large number of rotaries or carousels in the state. Based on the size of our dairy industry, I think we probably have a higher percentage of rotaries or carousels in relationship to the number of dairies than about any state I've ever been in. But these will milk a lot of cows in an hour, and it's partly because of larger herd size that we've gone to. Recently, in the last little while, now we've started going into robotics and technology. So the Laley machine that we have at the university is pictured here on the right-hand side. What maybe isn't as obvious is that there's other technologies being developed for milking cows. This is a screenshot from, it's called Rotary Mate by Green Source Automation. They have regional ties to here, and I can't remember. I think they're out of Idaho, or at least they have an office in Idaho. But here's one robot, here's another robot in the back here, and their sole purpose is to prep the cows before the milkers go on. If you want to go see them in action, you can just put this into a search engine, and there's a video that shows them in action. Quite interesting to watch them. There's also rotary parlors that are basically like the Laley, except that the milking apparatus comes out of the back here, and then it automatically attaches. So I can see more automation happening in the future, especially because of labor issues coming up. Okay, so to make a long story short, same number of cows in the state as when I first started, much, much fewer dairies, probably 80% decrease. The question that is going in the back of my mind is, what is a critical mass? How many dairies do you need in order to have this critical mass for an industry? And I think that we're getting to the point where we're gonna have to start talking about that a little bit. Dairies are much bigger than they were when I started. Then the question is how big can you go in Utah? I have some dairies that if they had their way would be building on the same scale as what you have in Idaho, but I just don't see 20,000 cow dairies going in Utah like they are in Idaho. And then much, much more milk per cow. And this, I think, will continue to increase, at least into the near future. I can come back to this later, but part of the reason why there's fewer and bigger dairies and more cows is because if you look at the amount of money that you're getting based on inflation, the amount of income has gone down. And this ends at the end of 2000, or ends at 2000. There's been an even bigger change as you've gone out here to 2020 and 2021, especially this volatility where prices are up and down. The bottom line here is that in order to keep in business, they have to be able to spread their costs over more animal units to keep the price down, or their expenses down. So let's talk a little bit about dairy extension in Utah, at least from what I've seen since I've been here. First point is personnel have decreased and considerably at the university and Bridgerland. When I first started, there was at least 5 or 6 faculty that were assigned at least part of their time to dairy. Now there's probably 2, maybe 3, depending on how you count it. But in terms of FTEs, there's probably just 2 FTEs versus 5 or 6 when I first started. The other point is that Bridgerland Tech had a herdsman program that was run in conjunction with our department. They bailed on that, so that the herdsman program's gone. Bridgerland also had an economist that would do the yearly finances for dairies within the region, so mainly Cache Valley, some across the border into Idaho, and a few over in Box Elder, but there would probably be 50 or 55 dairies a year that we could get the total finances for expenses and income for those dairies. That's gone also. Another thing we used to do was a 3D location traveling workshop every December. There was one in the southern part of the state, one in Utah County, and one here in Cache County. After the second dairy extension specialist retired, I ran this for 1 more year, and then I looked at it, and it cost me $10,000 for 10 dairy producers, and that represented probably 7 or 8 dairies. And I thought, you know what, it's just not worth it, and so I quit it. I had a dairy extension newsletter with about 1,250 people on it. Again, as people retired, left the business, or lost interest, it got to the point where it wasn't worth doing it. There was lots of site visits, phone calls, now not very many. Other thing that happened, and it's kind of why I gave you the background on DHIA, is the manager for Rocky Mountain DHIA was considered an employee of Utah State University because they ran his salary through the university so they could get salary and benefits. And because he was an employee of the university, I was the supervisor of the manager, even though there was a board that supervised and managed the manager. Created a really odd situation for me, especially where the board decided one time to fire the manager, but because he was a university employee, we had to go through the normal procedures for doing it. It was just really a nightmare. We don't do that anymore. When they tore down the building where they were housed, then the university kind of said, we're done, and that ended. The other thing that we used to do was multi-state extension. At one time, I covered 4 states, University of Wyoming, Montana State, University of Nevada, all hired me to provide 2 weeks in state, plus phone calls, emails, newsletter, things like that. So at one time I was doing that, but there was big budget cuts in about 2008, and this was the first thing that they cut out, was that. So what's changed then? And other states are the same way. Bigger dairies don't use extension, mainly because they have their own in-house personnel. For example, in-house veterinarians are common. They have consultants that they work with on a regular basis. I mean, regular as in, I know of one company that has one of their personnel whose sole responsibility is to take care of 2 different dairies. And not only do they have private consultants, but some of the companies also have expertise, and they basically are taking over the traditional duties of extension. Allied Industries now also provide traditional extension support. For example, milk processors now are doing a lot of things that the dairy extension did when I first started. Also, groups like Dairy Producers of Utah do more on-farm troubleshooting, consulting, evaluations, things like that, that traditionally we used to do. They also sponsor workshops and farm training and provide the money for it. The money, time, and focus for university extension has also changed over time. For example, I have one dairy that begs me to come visit them, but I know if I go there, it will basically chew up my whole year's budget in that one visit, and so I can't do it. And then they can get internet access that gives them immediate information for things that normally they'd call me up and ask for. So what has changed for me, my way of adapting is that I've tried to become more of a resource for these allied industries and companies. So if they need help, they come to me, and then that way I'm influencing the dairy producers by influencing those that are working directly with the dairy producer. The $64,000 question, though, is what is the future of dairy extension in the state? And to be honest, I really don't know what's going to look like in the future, but I can tell you that it's not going to be business as usual. It just can't be. So maybe the future is going to be somewhere in one of these issues that I've identified. And these are not solely Utah issues, but they're things that I see. So labor shortage is considered to be the #1 issue among dairy owners. And I think it's going to be even worse now that we have this urbanization that's going on in the state, where we're the fastest growing state in the United States. And as such, our labor is going to construction because they can make more money or as much money with shorter hours. The other reason I have this cost up here is because Washington State has now put in a law that says that they have to pay based on a 40-hour work week, and then anything above that's time and a half. Sooner or later, that's going to come back to Utah, and maybe it's not as big of an issue as I think, but the cost is going to play into it. But this urbanization is probably going to drive as much of the shortage as anything. But it's bigger than losing labor. It's the land that the dairies are on now becomes valuable for subdivisions and homes. 2 weeks ago, I was on a conference call with one of the boards I'm on, and they were talking about the fact that they can't find housing for their labor because houses are in such short supply here in the state, so they can't even find a place to house them. Water is going to become a big issue, and it's going to become urban versus ag. And right now, urban is looking towards ag as a source for their water. And I'm acutely aware of this because my mother just sold some land in Heber that was pasture land. And she has some shares of water that were left over. And now we're trying to figure out how to sell that water, because in the next few years, if we don't get it sold, the state's going to come and take it away from us. So it's coming to Cache Valley through the Bear River. It's going to be a big issue. Manure handling, I think, is an issue. EPA report from last year listed belching cows and manure handling as the two major concerns for dairy. And the way they wrote it up, I think manure handling is going to be high on their list in the near future. Sustainability with all that goes with it, I think is an issue. Cost of production is going to become an issue, especially now that feed costs are going up very rapidly, and it's going to affect dairies. Technically, we're not under supply management, but in reality, we have a supply management system, and this is holding back a lot of dairies and causing a lot of them to rethink whether they want to stay in business or not. And then the usual societal and social values. The number one that I know of right now is it's a concern is removing calves at birth. And finally, I don't know the answer to this, but that new dairy research facility that Idaho's putting in that's not that far away from us, I think is going to impact us in ways that we don't understand at this point, but it's something that ought to be kept in the back of our minds. So all of these are things to consider, things to look for in the future. Which way the department goes, I'm not really sure how it'll be. So with that, I want to just wrap up and thank all of you for a wonderful ride. I've enjoyed working with all of you very much, and it's been interesting being part of this. I picked these slides to kind of represent where we've been versus where we're going. The slide on the left was something I took when I was doing a consulting job in Nicaragua. And these animals are carrying milk in those cans from their dairy to a central spot where a truck will come and pick it up. And then the pictures on the right I put in for Dr. Rude as a reminder of some good times we had. This is, I guess, how you transport sheep in Azerbaijan. And I think we counted somewhere on the order of about 11 sheep or 12 sheep. We could never quite figure out how many were stashed back underneath there. But anyway, thank you. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Carrie.